The restaurant La Verità glowed like a jewel in the middle of Manhattan's night, a shrine built for power, where the wealthy came to eat, drink, and remind each other of their supremacy. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light across velvet drapes, their reflections shimmering in half-empty glasses of Bordeaux. The murmurs of conversation and the clinking of silver cutlery rose and fell like an orchestrated score, a symphony of indulgence. And at the center of it all, in the corner booth reserved for only the most exalted patrons, sat Richard Kane. Wore his authority like armor. His suit was a masterwork of tailoring, the subtle stitching, whispering of wealth old enough to be arrogant. His silver-streaked hair, combed immaculately back, gave him the look of a patrician statesman rather than a predator in a custom Armani cage. But predator he was, and tonight, like every night, he was the apex of this glittering jungle.
Across from him, Ethan Cole leaned forward with the nervous attentiveness of a pupil who dared not miss a word from his master. Young, ambitious, but trembling beneath the surface, Ethan was a perfect echo chamber for Richard's philosophy. He smiled at every quip, nodded vigorously at every pause, and laughed slightly too long whenever Richard graced the table with his rare humor. It was not admiration so much as survival, the kind of loyalty that blooms under fear and desperate hope for advancement. Between them sat the guest of honor, Hiroshi Takeda, a man of stillness and restraint whose black eyes absorb every flicker of movement without revealing judgment. Takeda's reputation traveled before him, a Japanese industrial magnate whose empire stretched from Osaka to Zurich, a man courted by governments and envied by rivals. His presence, the waiter glided by with the practiced silence of a shadow. He bent, set down a dish, refilled the glass, and was gone again. To Richard, such figures were furniture and decorations no different from crystal sconces. He ignored them completely. To Ethan, they were part of the play, markers of the exclusivity he longed to claim as his own. Only Takeda occasionally allowed his gaze to follow them, not in curiosity, but in quiet calculation. Richard leaned back, his deep voice rolling over the table like thunder restrained. "This city has forgotten what strength is." His hand hovered over the stem of his glass, fingers steady, as though the wine awaited his permission to be enjoyed. "They talk about growth, about sustainability. Sentimental words for men too weak to make hard choices." He swirled the ruby liquid slowly, the candlelight reflecting off its surface. "We strip away illusions. We cut to the bone. That is how empires are made." Ethan nodded furiously. "Exactly, Mr. Kane.
It is about vision, about daring to see where others are blind."
Takeda gave the faintest tilt of his head, the bare suggestion of a response, though his expression remained carved from stone. Richard, seeing only opportunity, pressed forward. Tonight was more than dinner. It was a theater of dominance. The heavy curtains framed the booth like a stage, and the other diners were merely an audience, unaware they were watching history disguised as gastronomy. Richard thrived in such environments. He had chosen La Verità not for its cuisine, though it was impeccable, but for the stage it provided. The restaurant was a cathedral for men like him, where the rituals of wealth were worshipped with reverence. Around them, the city breathed through glass windows. The skyline glittered in the distance, towers sharp against the night sky, as though bowing to the sovereign in the booth. Richard inhaled deeply, the scent of truffle oil and charred steak mingling with the faint perfume of money that clung to the air. He commanded to bring us a bottle of Chateau Margaux 99 without looking at the stuff. His voice was not a request, it was the law. He did not name the wine, as mortals might. He invoked its legend, as though testing whether the servant would stumble. Crimson opposed. Then a quiet, assured reply. "An excellent choice, sir." Realism, Richard did not glance up. His eyes were on Takeda, measuring him, seeking the subtle shift in posture, the crack in composure that would signal he had struck the right chord. Ethan's gaze darted between them like a dog desperate to predict its master's mood. The meal unfolded with precision, course after course appearing like offerings to the gods of ambition. Richard's voice filled the booth, steady, commanding, and unyielding, as he outlined strategies cloaked in euphemism. Market volatility, inefficiencies, cleansing. The words were daggers wrapped in silk, each a promise of ruin for someone unseen. Takeda listened, impassive, his silence a fortress. To Richard, silence was agreement. To Ethan, silence was terror. Silence was survival for the unseen figure in the black uniform who carried their plates. Richard Kane raised his glass. Finally, the deep red swirling like blood caught in crystal. "Gentlemen, tonight we drink not to chance, but to inevitability." His smile was a thin, predatory curve. For by the time this city wakes tomorrow, a new empire will already be taking root. The glasses met in a soft, resonant chime, the sound sharp and final. A toast not to camaraderie, but to conquest. And beneath it, unheard by the titans at the table, a heartbeat quickened in the shadows, waiting for the moment the predator would realize that not every stage is his to command. The weight of the tray pressed into her palm, steady and familiar, like the burden she had learned to carry in silence. For most of the guests at La Verità, she was nothing more than a flicker at the edge of their vision. A black uniform, a polite smile, hands that refilled glasses and cleared dishes without ever demanding acknowledgement. But to her, every step was a performance, every gesture a shield. Elena Weiss had long since mastered the art of invisibility. The ache in her feet was constant, a dull metronome ticking beneath her skin. 19 months had taught her body this rhythm, one born not from heels on marble floors as in a former life, but from sensible shoes grinding into plush crimson carpet, softened by spilled champagne and crumbs of foie gras. Once, she had walked the polished halls of Deutsche Strategic Bank in Berlin with her head held high. The echo of her steps a proclamation of belonging. Now, she drifted like a ghost between tables of financiers, politicians, and heirs, each cloaked in power she no longer possessed. She moved with a quiet precision, eyes lowered, smile rehearsed. The dishes she carried were ornate works of art, seared scallops kissed with saffron, veal medallions draped in reduction, but to her they were only weight, heavy plates anchoring her to a life that had unraveled. La Verità was her stage, but she was no actress reaching for applause. She was a shadow, a servant, present only when needed, forgotten the instant she left the table. Still, she felt the gaze of Maria, her manager, cut across the dining floor. Stout and sharp-eyed, Maria was not unkind, though her tone rarely softened. Earlier, she had leaned in with a whisper etched in warning. "Table 9, Kane himself. Be careful, Elena. Try not to draw his attention." The name had been enough to stir something unspoken in her chest. Richard Kane. A name printed on magazine covers, whispered in the corridors of power, scrawled in headlines about ruthless takeovers and surgical dismantlings. She knew the type well. Sharks are dressed in silk. Predators who measured everything by what it could yield, who cloaked destruction in the vocabulary of progress. She had faced them across glossy tables in Berlin boardrooms, when her life still bore the illusion of stability. As she crossed the dining floor toward his booth, the restaurant's noise dimmed into a strange clarity. The sound of forks clinking and conversations rising became a backdrop, a canvas painted with wealth and arrogance. Richard Kane's aura radiated from the corner booth before she reached it, commanding attention, bending the air around him. She approached with a choose, its label gleaming like a relic in candlelight. He did not look at her. None of them did, not really. The young one, Ethan, flicked his gaze briefly, nervously, as if her presence were a test he feared she might fail. The other man, Hiroshi Takeda, remained inscrutable, his calm demeanor revealing nothing.
Kane continued speaking, his voice rich and deliberate, as though the restaurant itself had been built to amplify his words. She performed the ritual with a grace carved from repetition. Presentation, uncorking, pouring. The liquid pooled in crystal glasses, shimmering darkly. Still, Kane did not pause. His words pressed forward, laced with arrogance, each phrase an incision. We strip away sentimentality. We cleanse. We expose the profitable core. Elena's hand remained steady, but inside her chest, something shifted, faint but undeniable. She had heard this cadence before, the clipped assurance, the disdain wrapped in polished syllables. It stirred a memory she had locked away, a ghost of a meeting room in Berlin, voices speaking the same language of efficiency and cleansing while lives were dismantled. Ryu, careful not to linger or betray the sudden quickening of her pulse. She retreated toward the service station, where a cutlery tray waited to be polished. Her fingers worked automatically, cloth moving against steel. But her mind was no longer in the dining room. The rhythm of Kane's speech echoed in her memory, unsettling in its familiarity. No. She forced herself to breathe, to anchor herself in the task. Every powerful man sounds the same, she told herself. Arrogance is a universal dialect. It means nothing. Her past was a locked box. She had buried it, sealed it, and walked away from it. She could not open it now, not in the middle of this performance. And yet, as she moved back toward the booth to deliver sparkling water, a current of unease hummed beneath her skin. Kane leaned forward, his tone sharpening, his words suddenly shifting into German. Her breath caught. The syllables struck her like a blow, precise and familiar. It was not the casual German of tourists or the softened cadence of students abroad. This was High German, spoken with a faint Hessian accent of Frankfurt's financial district, the dialect of her former world. Her hand froze over a silver fork. For a single heartbeat, she was back in Berlin, the lights of the boardroom glaring, the weight of responsibility pressing into her shoulders. She forced herself to move, polishing steadily, invisibly, but her pulse thundered in her ears. And then she heard it. A name. A project. A word that did not belong here, across an ocean, whispered like a ghost into the plush air of La Verità. Paul, Project Chimera. The fork slipped slightly in her hand, catching the light as if in warning. Her mask held, her expression neutral, but her world had shifted. The predator at table 9 had just spoken the language of her ruin, unaware that the ghost he had buried was standing only feet away carrying his water. The name clanged inside her head like the tolling of an iron bell, relentless and resonant. Project Chimera. Elena's fingers tightened around the tray, as though gripping a lifeline. She lowered her gaze, feigning the same mechanical poise she had cultivated for months, but inside her chest, the ghosts she had buried clawed their way out of the dark. The syllables dragged her backward, tearing open the vault where she had sealed her past, hurling her into memory. Me, 3 years earlier. The glass towers of the Deutsche Strategic Bank had shimmered against the pale sky, each window reflecting her ambition at her. She had been Elena Weiss, 32, a lead analyst known for her sharp insight and meticulous reports. She had believed numbers could be shields, strategies could be weapons, that truth could fend off vultures.
She had thought about the work, and she had been proud. Nordstern AG, a family-owned engineering firm from Stuttgart, its history built on precision and loyalty. Their workforce spanned generations, fathers and daughters on the same factory floor, their pride as much in tradition as in product. When whispers of a hostile takeover had surfaced, Eleanor had been tasked with designing the defense. She had pored over their ledgers, mapped out contingencies, and built a fortress of logic. She had been certain she could protect them. But then came the leak. It was not merely a release of data, but a corruption of it. Minor alterations, subtle shifts, projections skewed just enough to paint her as reckless, her models as fraudulent. The numbers, once her fortress, turned traitor. In a single week, she had gone from rising star to scapegoat. Nordstern crumbled under the attack. Her firm discarded her like dead weight. And the financial press feasted on the story of the incompetent analyst who had destroyed her client. She had fled Berlin with shame and the whisper of a name she discovered too late. Project Chimera. Now it had returned, spoken carelessly by the man at table 9, as though it were nothing more than a line item in his portfolio. Kane's voice rolled over her like thunder. The board is weak, clinging to the past. With Chimera, we strip the carcass clean. His German was smooth, confident, each syllable sharpened by arrogance. Elena's breath hitched, but her body did not betray her. She placed the glass of San Pellegrino on the table, filled it with practiced elegance, and drifted back toward the service station. Every step was deliberate, every movement anchored in the mask she had worn for 19 months. But her mind was no longer in La Verità. It was in Berlin, among broken papers and headlines that had called her negligent. Voice joined Kane's, eager and overeager, stumbling through less polished German. Yes, absolutely, sir. Our internal models show a 40% cost reduction once we dismantle. Project Chimera will be brilliant. His tone was sycophantic, his laughter brittle, the sound of a man desperate to be acknowledged. Elena steadied herself against the counter, polishing silverware as if her life depended on the rhythm. Breathe. Control the mask. Invisible. You are invisible. But the name echoed again and again, each repetition sharpening into clarity. Kane wasn't just another predator. He was part of the shadowy cabal that had orchestrated her fall. Perhaps not just part, maybe the architect. Commemorate toward the booth. Kane leaned forward, gesturing with his fork as though conducting a symphony only he could hear. Ethan nodded, wide-eyed, while Hiroshi Takeda listened with the patience of a stone. He had not spoken much, but Elena noticed the way his eyes flickered once, just once, toward her. A glint of awareness, or perhaps only curiosity? Whatever it was, it unsettled her more than Kane's booming confidence. Her pulse roared in her ears as fragments of memory collided with the present, the altered spreadsheets, the boardroom whispers, the humiliating silence when her defense collapsed. And now, here, a mirror image, different faces, different city, but the same cruelty, the same dismantling of lives, dressed up as progress. Her stomach twisted with dread and fury, cold and hot at once. She wanted to slam the cutlery onto the table, shatter the illusion of servitude, and scream that she knew exactly who Kane was and what he had done. But she forced herself still. Patience. Every instinct screamed for caution. He did not know who she was. He saw only a waitress, a decorative shadow. That ignorance was her weapon now. The laughter from the booth swelled, arrogant and unrestrained. Kane spoke again, seamlessly switching back into English to remind the world he owned both tongues. Progress is cleansing, gentlemen. Sentimentality is the enemy of profit. Their patents are all we need. Their people are ballast. Elena's nails dug into the polished steel of the fork she held. Ballast. That single word crystallized everything. To him, lives were disposable weight, cast aside for efficiency. To her, those lives had been names and faces, engineers who believed her strategy would protect them, workers who had lost their livelihoods when Chimera gutted Northern. She swallowed hard and forced herself to keep moving. She could not let the storm inside her spill into the open. Not yet. There was too much at stake. Kane's words had given her something she had long believed lost forever. Confirmation. He was tied to Chimera, and Chimera was tied to her ruin. As she drifted past table 9 again, tray balanced effortlessly, Kane's eyes slid past her without recognition. He smirked, dismissing her as part of the furniture, then turned back to Hiroshi with the air of a man confident he owned the world. He did not know the ghost he had summoned.
Michalena moved through the restaurant like smoke, her face a mask, her heart a drumbeat of rage and revelation. She was no longer simply a waitress, she was a witness, and deep within her, the ember of something long buried began to glow again. Not revenge, not yet, but something sharper, something steadier, justice. The insult came casually, like a flick of ash from a cigar, meant to drift unnoticed, and yet burning where it landed. Kane lifted his fork and gestured vaguely toward the staff, his lips curving with contempt. "These people," he said in German, "are nothing but decoration, furniture, shadows, tools." Then his eyes, sharp and indifferent, slid across Elena as though she were glass. "Probably a failed artist," he added in a lower tone to Ethan, his smirk deepening, a pretty empty face with no thoughts worth mentioning. Ethan chuckled nervously, eager to mirror his master, though his laughter rang hollow. Elena felt her lungs seize. The tray in her hands grew unbearably heavy, though it held only empty glasses. The restaurant's noise receded for a second, replaced by the white rush of her pulse. She had heard insults in boardrooms, and cafes whispered in scandalous headlines that tore her life apart. But here, from this man, it was something else entirely. He was mocking her in the very language of her birth, in the same rhythm used to dismantle her career, in the same cadence that once carried the orders that erased her name. She forced her brang against the roof of her mouth until the tremor in her hands subsided. Do not react. That was the rule. Invisible, efficient, forgettable. But beneath the mask of silence, fire licked at her bones. It wasn't the insult alone, the convergence, the cruel symmetry of it all. Her ghost from Berlin had not just returned. It was sitting at table 9, savoring filet mignon and dismissing her existence with a sneer. Hiroshi Takeda raised his glass slowly, his eyes lingering on Elena for just a fraction longer than politeness required. He did not smile, did not frown, but something flickered there. Curiosity? Discomfort? Perhaps even recognition that this woman was not what she appeared. The awareness unsettled her almost as much as Kane's scorn, for witnesses could be as dangerous as predators. Kane, oblivious, carried on. "Once we secure control, gentlemen, the first cut will be the research division. Overvalued sentimentality, he called it. Too expensive to maintain, too rooted in pride. The patents are all that matter." He savored the words, each one a surgical slice across memories Elena had fought to bury. They were the same plans whispered in Berlin, the cold arithmetic that gutted Northern. And now the architect sat before her, bragging as though the ruin of lives were a trophy to display. Her hand did not falter as she poured water into his glass.
Her face remained the polished neutrality of a servant, yet behind her still eyes
The fury coalesced into clarity. For 19 months she had endured silence, swallowed her pride, bent under the weight of exile. But the match had been struck. The flame had caught. She drifted back toward the service station, her steps deliberate, each one heavier with decision. Maria, her manager, met her gaze briefly from across the room, offering the faintest sympathetic smile, unaware of the storm gathering in Elena's chest. To Maria, this was another night, another set of demanding patrons. To Elena, it was the night her past had stepped into the light and dared to look her in the eye. Her reflection in the polished steel of the counter startled her. She no longer saw only the weary waitress with the dull gray eyes. She told,
Beneath the fatigue, she caught a glimpse of someone else, the analyst, the fighter, the woman who once believed she could hold back giants with strategy and resolve. The woman Cain had destroyed, but not extinguished. As dessert was served, Cain leaned back like a Roman emperor, patting his stomach with satisfaction. His voice boomed through the booth, heavy with arrogance. He snapped his fingers at her without looking. "The check," he commanded in English, then muttered in German with a cruel laugh. "Hurry up, girl. We have more important things to do than wait for you." Something inside her snapped. The sound was not loud, not visible, but it was final. The years of humiliation, fear, and invisibility collapsed into a single unshakable truth. She could no longer remain silent. She placed the tray down slowly, each movement precise, controlled. Then she turned her steps steady. Not the hurried shuffle of service, but the measured cadence of authority. The gait of the woman who once strode into boardrooms with fire in her eyes. She walked back toward table 9 empty-handed, with no bill folder, no props, and only the weapon of her voice. Cain glanced up, his expression tinged with irritation at being delayed. His smirk wavered when he met her gaze, direct, unyielding, alive with something he could not name. Elena smiled. Not the soft curve of politeness she had worn for months, but a sharper smile, a blade hidden in plain sight. When it came, her voice was quiet yet thunderous in its precision. "Excuse me, sir," she said in flawless German, her tone formal, exact. The voice of an educated professional and not a servant. "Your grammar is sloppy. When addressing a woman, even a waitress, it is more appropriate to say young lady or miss, not girl. It shows respect." The restaurant hushed. Cain's fork stilled. Ethan's breath hitched audibly. Hiroshi set down his glass, his gaze sharpening, studying her with new intensity. In that silence, Elena stood revealed not as furniture, not as shadow, but as herself. The spark had ignited into flame, and there would be no turning back. The air between them trembled with the weight of words that had already shifted the balance of the evening. Once smug with the satisfaction of victory, Cain's face cracked like porcelain struck by a hammer. His fork slipped from his fingers, clattering against fine china, the sound unnaturally loud in the hush that followed Elena's correction. Ethan froze mid-breath, his pale complexion draining further, as if the blood itself sought to flee the scene. Hiroshi, by contrast, leaned forward slightly, hands folded, his gaze fixed on Elena with the sharp focus of a strategist watching a game take an unexpected turn. Elena did not falter. She stood upright, her presence no longer that of a servant, but of someone who had carried a weight far heavier than a tray of crystal glasses. She directly met Cain's eyes, forcing him to see her not as background or furniture, but as an adversary. "Sometimes," she continued, her voice smooth and deliberate, "one overhears things. For example, Nordstern's board may be weak, or that Project Chimera is meant to dismantle its research and development division, stripping it bare for patents. She let the words hang in the air, each syllable like a gavel strike. The silence at table 9 deepened. Ethan's fork slipped from his trembling hand and fell with a loud metallic thud against his dessert plate, startling even himself. Kane's complexion shifted from pallor to a dangerous mottled red. Veins taut against his temples. He opened his mouth, but no words came at first. Then, a low growl, half German, half English. Absurd. You have no idea what you are talking about.
Eavesdropping on private matters, that is grounds for immediate dismissal. Elena's smile sharpened, her eyes glinting with a calm fury honed over 19 months of silent survival. Grounds for dismissal, she replied, her voice edged with iron. You already dismissed me once, Mr. Kane. You erased me, stripped me of my name, my work, my reputation. But tonight you handed me proof of your sins, along with your arrogance, on a silver platter. Khan's eyes narrowed, a flicker of recognition darting across his expression like a shadow. He searched her face, scrambling through memory, through enemies forgotten and discarded. His voice dropped, low and taut. Who are you? For a heartbeat, Elena hesitated, the weight of 2 years pressing against her chest. Then she lifted her chin, her voice clear and resonant in perfect German. My name is Elena Vogel. The name struck like lightning. Kane's jaw slackened, his lips parting in disbelief. Ethan choked audibly, the syllables clanging against his ears like bells tolling doom. Hiroshi did not move, but his eyes widened with interest, his calm demeanor flickering with something sharper. Acknowledgement. Elena did not stop there. She stepped closer, her words slow and deliberate, each carrying the gravity of memory. I was a lead analyst at Deutsche Strategic Bank. I designed the defensive strategy that would have saved Nordstern from your first assault. It was flawless, until the data I built it on was stolen, altered, and turned into a weapon against me. You didn't just orchestrate the attack, you orchestrated my destruction. Kane's face shifted from recognition to horror. He remembered now. The ghost of Berlin had returned, not broken, but alive, standing before him with a gaze sharpened into steel. Elena continued. You thought I would disappear, her voice a low, precise blade. You hid behind shell companies, behind lawyers, behind names like Ethelred Holdings. But tonight you exposed yourself, and I am done being silent. Ethan's hands fumbled with his napkin, his panic barely contained. His lips moved soundlessly, as though he were calculating how to survive the sudden implosion of his world. Kane's composure shattered entirely. Gone was the predatory smile, replaced by the rigid mask of a man staring at the ruin of his control. Hiroshi's voice entered the silence then, calm yet heavy with finality. Miss Vogel, he said, his English deliberate. Your name is known to me as well. Years ago, Ethelred Holdings approached my company with proposals that bore the same stench of dishonor you describe. We declined. We value integrity above predation. His eyes shifted toward Kane, cold and unyielding. Tonight confirms the wisdom of that decision. He folded his napkin, placed it on the table, and stood. Kane, he said, without raising his voice, our dinner is finished, as is any possibility of partnership. Einer than any blade.
Kane lurched forward, his face contorted with fury. You, he hissed at Elena, his voice shaking. You are finished. I will bury you deeper than before. You will never work, never live free again. I will see you scrubbing floors in every corner of this city until you collapse. Elena did not flinch. Her voice, quiet yet unbreakable, sliced through his threats. You already did your worst to me, Kane.
You cannot frighten me anymore. Tonight you didn't bury me, you resurrected me. Gone still. Patrons stared from nearby tables, sensing that something monumental had shifted. Maria hovered at the edge of the scene, uncertain but watchful. Cain's threats echoed hollowly in the heavy air, the sound of a man unmoored. Crimson removed her small name tag and placed it gently on the table beside the half-eaten chocolate cake. I quit, she said, softly, almost kindly, but with a finality that rang like steel.
She looked briefly at Maria with an apologetic smile, then turned and walked away. At the exit, Hiroshi waited. He bowed slightly, offering her a card between his fingers. Miss Fogel, he said with quiet authority, what was done to you was an injustice. What was planned for Nordstern is a disease. I would very much like to hear your story. We may have shared interests. The card gleamed black in her trembling hand, impossibly heavy with possibility. She had walked out with nothing, yet in that moment she realized she had carried everything she needed, the truth, her name, and the strength to wield them again. The night air outside the restaurant was sharp, brimming with the scent of rain and city smoke. Elena leaned against the rough brick wall of the alley, her breath uneven, her hands trembling from the surge of adrenaline. She had done what she never thought possible, stood against Cain Mercer, the man who had stolen her career and nearly destroyed her life. Now, the echo of her own words lingered in her ears like the aftermath of thunder. She was free, yes, but she was also exposed. For the first time in nearly 2 years, she had declared her name aloud to those who had hunted it into silence. Back inside, Cain seethed. His empire had been shaken before a critical witness, and worse, his most dangerous secret had been revealed to the one woman who had reason to dismantle him. He replayed her words again and again, each one a cut that refused to stop bleeding. Ethan hovered at his side, pale and sweating, mumbling empty reassurances while Cain's fury only deepened. Hiroshi's refusal had not just ended a deal, it had crippled Cain's future, at least for the moment. Rage, humiliation, and fear coiled together inside him until only one thought crystallized. Elena Vogel must be silenced. Elena's steps through the narrow streets were unsteady but purposeful. Every nerve in her body screamed at her to run, to vanish once more into anonymity. Yet another voice, one steadier and stronger, urged her forward. The card in her hand, slick with the damp of her palms, gleamed faintly under the streetlights. Hiroshi Sato, CEO of Sato Heavy Industries. A man of immense resources had seen her not as a waitress, not as a ghost, but as someone worthy of being heard. That thought alone was enough to keep her spine straight as she returned to her tiny apartment in Queens. The following morning, the adrenaline had curdled into a restless anxiety. She had not slept, her mind replaying every moment at table 9, every word Cain had spoken in arrogance, every syllable she had thrown back at him. The fragile sense of victory was eclipsed by dread. Cain now knew she lived. He knew her face, voice, and name. If he had destroyed her once with the cold precision of corporate betrayal, what would stop him from killing her now with more brutal tools? Her phone buzzed. She jumped, heart hammering, half expecting a summons, a threat, or worse. But the screen showed nothing but a message from an old co-worker she had not spoken to in years, a reminder of the life she once had. She ignored it, staring at the black business card on her nightstand. Hiroshi had given her a lifeline, but accepting it meant stepping back into the dangerous world she had tried so hard to escape. Still, she realized with sudden clarity, there was no going back. Cain would come for her whether she ran or not. The only choice was whether she faced him alone or with allies. The city roared outside her window, indifferent to her private storm. She dressed carefully, not in the drab uniform of the restaurant,
but in a simple blouse and jacket that reminded her faintly of the professional she once was. With trembling hands, she dialed the number etched into the card. The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, and immediate. When she gave her name, she was connected without hesitation.
Miss Vogel. Hiroshi's voice came through the line, calm and steady. I am glad you called. He invited her to meet at his hotel, the Mandarin Oriental, within the hour. Elena hesitated only briefly before agreeing. The walk through Central Park toward the towering glass hotel felt surreal. Once she had walked into conference halls and boardrooms with confidence. Now she felt like a ghost, drifting toward an unfamiliar destiny. Yet the atmosphere shifted when the elevator doors opened into Hiroshi's suite. The space was less a residence than a command center. It was quiet, but charged with purpose. Hiroshi greeted her with the same calm authority she had seen in the restaurant, but this time there was something different in his eyes. Respect. Beside him stood a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s, whom he introduced as Akari Tanaka, his head of legal. Elena realized instantly that this was no casual meeting. This was a strategy in motion. For hours, she poured out her story, every painful detail of her fall. She spoke of the hostile takeover of Nordstern, the stolen data, the altered reports, and the brutal way she had been cast aside. Her voice cracked at times, but Hiroshi and Akari listened without interruption. They asked pointed questions, clarifying details, piecing together the mosaic of betrayal that had unraveled her life. By the time she finished, her throat was raw, her hands clenched white in her lap. Akari was the first to respond. What you describe, Miss Vogel, is a textbook smear and acquire strategy. Sabotage the defense, discredit the protector, and devour the target. Kane Mercer was the mind behind it, but men like him rarely act alone. She leaned forward, her eyes sharp as glass. To prove this, we need more than your word. We need the original files, the unaltered data. Elena felt a surge of hopelessness. It's gone. After I was dismissed, my access was revoked. They must have erased everything.
Perhaps, Hiroshi interjected gently, not erased. Men like Kane are arrogant, and arrogance leads to carelessness. Digital ghosts have a way of lingering. With the right resources, those ghosts can be resurrected. Elena felt the weight of possibility pressing against the despair for the first time in years. Hiroshi did not speak as a man offering charity. He spoke as someone preparing for war. His voice was calm, but beneath it paused the resolve of a strategist who had chosen his battlefield. We have resources, Miss Vogel. Legal, financial, technological. But we need your knowledge. You know the names, the structures, the way Kane moves in the shadows. Together, we can expose him. Elena looked from Hiroshi to Akari, the enormity of their offer sinking in. For so long she had lived as a ghost and her only goal was survival. Now, for the first time, she was offered more than survival. She was being provided justice. Her hand brushed the card still in her pocket, that impossibly heavy token of fate. She straightened, her voice firm though her heart thundered in her chest. Then let's begin. The suite at the Mandarin Oriental no longer felt like a place of luxury. It was a war room charged with silent determination. Whiteboards crowded the walls, scrawled with timelines, names, and arrows that connected webs of deceit. Laptops hummed, phones buzzed with encrypted calls, and a steady stream of coffee cups collected on every surface. Elena sat at the heart of it all, her mind shifting from the cautious rhythms of survival to the sharp, analytical focus she had once commanded in Berlin. The ghosts of her past were no longer shadows in the corners of her memory. They had names, dates, and codes, and she would bring them to light. Kang's first objective was Hinrich Bauer, the man who had replaced her at the Deutsche Strategic Bank and who had likely served as Kane Mercer's mole. Miss Tanaka's investigators traced his new life to Zurich, where he lived extravagantly, far beyond his legitimate salary. A Porsche, private poker nights, and a second apartment all pointed to the reckless arrogance of a man who believed himself untouchable. Greed and ego, Elena muttered, studying his file. That is the leverage we need. But leverage was not enough. What they required was undeniable proof of the original crime. Elena explained how the sabotage had unfolded, the subtle alterations in financial projections that had tainted her strategy as reckless. There was a 12% dip here and an 18% increase there, which seemed plausible individually but catastrophic together. She knew the patterns, the fingerprints of manipulation. If the data still existed, she would recognize it instantly. Akari Tanaka pressed a finger against her temple as she thought. Deutsche Bank would have archived the files. They could not simply erase them without creating suspicious gaps. Likely, they are sealed within a litigation hold server, she said. We will compel them to release it. But the bank's first response was a wall of corporate denial. Privacy laws, expired access rights, and the statute of limitations were their shield. Akari's expression never wavered. She scheduled a video conference with the bank's general counsel, and when her face appeared on the screen, she wielded her words like a blade. Herr Schmidt, she began, her tone deceptively cordial. We are not on a fishing expedition. We have credible intelligence that a former employee, Ms. Vogel, was the victim of internal espionage. We know the files exist on server serial number 7 Alpha Delta. Refusal to comply will force us to file a motion, and I assure you, the optics of hiding evidence to protect a saboteur will damage your institution's reputation far more than compliance will.
The veiled threat, combined with Hiroshi's silent but unmistakable weight as a global industrial titan, broke through the resistance. 48 hours later, an encrypted data file arrived on their secure channel. Its size was immense, and it was a sprawling report, log, and buried metadata archive. Clang, that was when Saito, the forensic analyst, took over. A wiry young man with sleepless eyes and fingers that never seemed to stop moving. He dove into the labyrinth of files with the focus of a surgeon. Elena hovered close, her breath caught in her throat, watching lines of code and timestamps scroll across his screens. Hours turned into days. She barely slept, pacing the suite like a caged animal, whispering silent prayers that the ghosts were still there. On the third night, as dawn painted Central Park in a pale glow, Saito called her over. His face was drained with exhaustion, but his eyes glimmered with triumph. I found it, he whispered. His hands moved quickly, opening 2 documents side by side. On the left is a file labeled EV Nordstraat Draft VFL. On the right, HB Nordstraat Final Revision. The timestamp difference between them was 97 minutes. Elena leaned forward, her pulse surging in her ears. She scanned the numbers, the small but devastating changes. Revenue projections cut, cost estimates bloated, ratios warped just enough to render her work incompetent. Her breath caught. That is it, she whispered. That is precisely what destroyed me. Shield Saito nodded, and then, flourishing, he pulled up the server access logs. They showed her file uploaded at 4:15 p.m. Berlin time. At 4:30 p.m. it had been accessed and downloaded from Heinrich Bauer's terminal. At 5:52 p.m. the sabotaged version was uploaded. Finally, at 6:10 p.m. an encrypted data packet was sent from Bauer's system to an offshore server registered in the Cayman Islands. Akari's team had already traced that server to a shell company under Kane Mercer's control. The evidence was there, pristine and damning. A chain of betrayal recorded in cold digital ink. Elena pressed a trembling hand to her lips, a tear slipping down her cheek. It was not grief. It was vindication. The truth she had been denied for so long had risen from the ashes of data and timestamps. For a long moment,
No one spoke. The suite hummed with the quiet of machines, the city waking outside, and the weight of revelation settling upon them. At last, Hiroshi broke the silence. The crime is laid bare. Now we decide how to wield it. Wilmington stood straighter, her eyes no longer weary, but blazing. For 2 years she had been erased, invisible. But now the proof was alive in their hands, and the promise of justice came with it. This was no longer about survival. It was about war. The confrontation with Heinrich Bauer unfolded not in a courtroom or boardroom, but in the quiet luxury of a Geneva hotel cafe. It was deliberate, calculated to strip him of the comfort of power, while denying him the stage he might use to bluster his way out. Bauer arrived late, smugness painted across his face. He was wearing an expensive suit and a careless grin that screamed invulnerability. To him, this was just another minor inconvenience, a meeting with people he assumed were powerless. He ordered an espresso, drummed his fingers against the polished table, and barely looked at the people across from him. Akari Tanaka sat opposite him, poised and unreadable, her tablet resting on the table like a weapon waiting to be drawn. Elena sat beside her, silent but focused, her eyes fixed on the man who had stolen her career and identity. She watched his movements, the smug curve of his mouth, the arrogance in his posture, and it all burned into her memory.
Hiroshi Mercer was absent from this meeting, by design. This was not the place for a titan. It was a surgical strike led by those who knew how to dismantle arrogance piece by piece. Mr. Bauer. Miss Tanaka began softly, her voice so calm it forced him to lean closer. We are here because we have reason to believe you have violated both the trust of your employer and the laws of multiple jurisdictions. She slid the first tablet across the table. On its screen glowed detailed logs of insider trades, stock movements that were far too perfect to be a coincidence. Bauer chuckled, shaking his head as though humoring a child. Insider trading? That is a heavy accusation, he said with exaggerated amusement. How often have I heard that from people who don't understand the market? He took a slow sip of his espresso, his confidence unshaken. But then Miss Tanaka tapped the screen, zooming in on specific timestamps, trade IDs, and the direct correlations with Davenport Capital's private meetings. The smirk faltered just slightly, a flicker of unease that Elena caught instantly. You see, Miss Tanaka continued, this is not speculation, this is proof. And while insider trading may seem like a minor offense to you, it is enough to collapse the cushioned life you've built here. You could lose everything, your apartment, your career, your reputation. But that, Mr. Bauer, is not why we are here. Before Bauer could respond, she slid the second tablet across. Elena knew what it contained, but held her breath as Bauer's eyes flicked down at the glowing screen. The two files were side by side. The original Nordstrat defense plan Elena had authored and his corrupted revision. The server log spelled out the entire crime, his access to a file, the changes he had made, and the transmission to the Cayman Islands server. Comfy scowl from Bauer's face. He set down his espresso cup with a trembling hand. That's fabricated, he snapped. But his voice lacked conviction.
Anyone could... No, Elena interrupted for the first time, her voice sharp, cutting through the false bravado.
That is my work, Bauer. Every word, every number. I wrote it. You twisted it to ruin me.
She leaned forward, her eyes locked on his.
You didn't just take my career. You tried to erase me.
For the first time, Bauer truly looked at her, and recognition dawned. His lips parted to form a denial, but no words came. His arrogance had been his armor, but now it cracked under the weight of undeniable evidence. Miss Tanaka pressed forward, her voice like ice.
My client has no desire to see you rot in a cell. She wants the truth about who gave the orders, who orchestrated the sabotage, and who benefited from your betrayal. You will provide a complete, signed confession detailing Kane Mercer's role. In exchange, we will offer this insider trading evidence to the authorities as context for leniency. You will not escape punishment, Mr. Bauer, but you will avoid the full force of the law.
Bauer's breathing quickened. His eyes darted around the room searching for an exit, a lifeline. But there was none. He was cornered, stripped bare, the weight of his sins pressing down with suffocating intensity. His arrogance dissolved into something raw and animalistic. Fear. He whispered a denial, then another, before finally his voice cracked and the truth spilled out. Yes, he admitted, his words tumbling over each other. It was Mercer. It was always Mercer. He wanted the takeover and patents and he told me to do it. He promised me protection, promotion and wealth. I was his instrument. His hands shook as he signed the confession, each ink stroke carving his betrayal into permanence. When it was done, the café felt quieter, as though the world had paused to acknowledge the moment. Elena watched him collapse into his chair, a broken man where once there had been smug arrogance. For years he had carried the secret of her downfall like a shield.
Now that the shield was shattered.
Miss Tanaka gathered the signed documents, her movements precise and unhurried. "This," she said, "is the end of your protection. What comes next is your choice. Live with the mercy we grant you, or fall under the weight of your crimes." As Bauer buried his face in his hands, Elena felt a strange stillness. The man who had been the instrument of her ruin was finished. But she knew this was only the beginning. Bauer was not the architect, only the pawn. Kane Mercer was still out there, and now they had the weapon to strike at him directly. Elena rose from her seat, her posture steady, her eyes hard with resolve. The confession was in their hands. The truth no longer buried in servers or whispers. The war against Kane Mercer had reached its breaking point, and the battlefield had just shifted in her favor. The news broke just after dawn, when the city was still cloaked in grey light and silence, and it hit like a thunderclap. 3 of the most respected financial publications released their coordinated exposés simultaneously. The Wall Street Journal's headline read, "The Mercer Files. Leaked documents revealed years of corporate espionage." The Financial Times declared that Mercer Capital, framed analyst, should seize the German engineering firm. Handelsblatt in Germany was even sharper, calling Kane Mercer the predator of Wall Street. Screens lit up in trading floors from New York to Frankfurt to Tokyo, and within minutes the market convulsed. Elena stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, the Manhattan skyline stretching before her, her phone buzzing endlessly with notifications. Each alert was another dagger thrust into Kane Mercer's empire. Trading on Mercer Capital-linked companies was halted within hours. The SEC, BaFin, and Swiss authorities announced coordinated investigations, a rare move that signaled the magnitude of the scandal. It was not just a stumble for Kane Mercer, it was a cataclysm. Inside Mercer Capital, panic reigned. The emergency board meeting, usually a polished affair conducted with controlled voices and fine suits, descended into shouting matches and frantic calls. Investors who had once celebrated Mercer's ruthlessness now turned on him with the savagery of cornered animals. The very allies he had made rich were scrambling to distance themselves, clawing back bonuses, cutting ties, and preparing their legal defenses. Kane Mercer, the man who once believed himself untouchable, was suddenly isolated. His calls went unanswered, his charm ineffective, his threats hollow. He faced a storm he could not even bribe, intimidate, or manipulate away.
In a single morning, he transformed from kingmaker to liability. Elena watched the chaos unfold through the television mounted on the wall, her reflection flickering faintly in the glass. News anchors replayed her name again and again. Elena Volk, the analyst erased by false data, the woman who had risen from obscurity to dismantle a financial giant. To the world, she was no longer invisible. She symbolized resistance against predation, the underdog who had struck a decisive blow. Yet, as vindication coursed through her, there was no triumphal smile. Instead, there was a somber stillness. A single morning's headlines could not erase years of injustice. The victory was real, but it was not pure. She had exposed Kane Mercer and destroyed his empire, but the cost of her lost years still lingered like scars across her soul. The board of Mercer Capital acted swiftly, desperate to contain the fallout. They voted to sever Kane from the firm in an unprecedented move. It was not a negotiation, it was an execution. They clawed back every cent they could legally recover, stripped him of his titles, and left him to face the avalanche of lawsuits and investigations as a pariah. Cameras swarmed the entrance of Mercer Capital's glass tower in Midtown, capturing the image of Kane leaving the building for what would likely be the last time. His once immaculate appearance was frayed, his tie loose, his hair unkempt, his expression a storm of rage and disbelief. The man who had held entire industries in his grip now looked like a dethroned monarch, bitter and broken. Kane AB began almost immediately. Deutsche Strategic Bank reached out with a formal settlement offer, a 9-figure sum so staggering it made her hands tremble when she saw it. They wanted the scandal buried quickly, the embarrassment softened with money. Other banks and firms flooded her inbox with offers. Senior analyst roles, director positions, leadership opportunities. They wanted the woman who had outplayed Kane Mercer on their team. But when she looked at those offers, she felt only a quiet detachment. Returning to that word and once again sharpening spreadsheets into weapons for men like Kane felt like a betrayal of everything she had endured. She did not fight this war to return to the same game with different players. Instead, she met with Hiroshi Mercer one last time in the dismantled war room. Once covered in maps, timelines, and strategy, the walls were now bare, the servers silent, the markers dried out. Hiroshi laid his vision before her, his voice calm but carrying the weight of conviction. The Prometheus Institute, he said, a non-profit dedicated to accountability and ethics in global finance. A coalition of companies led by Kobayashi Industries would fund it to ensure it had the power and reach to expose corruption and protect whistleblowers. I want you to lead it, Elena. Europe needs a face, a voice, a guardian. You are all three.
Neither choice lay heavy before her. Yet it was also liberating. She was not cornered by necessity or survival for the first time in years. She had power, not just over her life, but to shape the battlefield. She thought of the nights in Aria, carrying plates, bowing her head, being invisible. She thought of the humiliation, the despair, the endless ache of being erased. Then she thought of the fire that had brought her here, the fire she refused to let die. As the world devoured the story of Kane Mercer's fall, Elena Volk made her decision. She would not play the old game, she would change it, and though the reckoning had begun with him, it would not end there. This was only the first strike in a new kind of war, where silence was no longer the currency of survival, but truth was the weapon that toppled empires. The war room
had settled into a tense rhythm of strategy and anticipation.
Elena had grown used to the constant hum of servers, the scribbled names on whiteboards, and the clipped exchanges between Hiroshi's legal team and the investigators scattered across Europe. Every hour brought new fragments of intelligence, but what they needed most still lay hidden: the untouched data from her days at Deutsche Strategic Bank, the proof that her work had been sabotaged. Late one evening, as rain lashed against the windows of the penthouse, Elena's phone buzzed with an international number. She hesitated before answering, her breath catching when she recognized the trembling voice of Professor Brandt, her old mentor from Heidelberg. His words came rushed, urgent, carrying both relief and dread. He had followed her downfall in silence, always believing in her innocence, and now he brought a revelation. A former student working in IT at the bank had quietly checked the archives. Her files had not been deleted.
They were preserved in a litigation hold server, dormant but intact. For a moment, Elena couldn't breathe. All the hopeless nights she had spent convincing herself the truth was gone forever dissolved instantly. The ghost she had chased, the one she thought was lost, was real. But with that revelation came another. Brandt told her of the man who had replaced her, Heinrich Bauer, the ambitious analyst who rose quickly after her dismissal. Bauer now sat comfortably at Mercer Capital's European headquarters. The pieces locked together like a cruel puzzle. He had been the inside hand, who had stolen her files, altered her data, and passed it along to Mercer's shell corporation. Going these to Hiroshi and Akari, the weight of the room shifted. The enemy was no longer just Mercer, distant and shielded by layers of corporations and lawyers. There was a traitor with a name, a man who could be cornered. Their mission became laser-focused. The digital ghosts had to be retrieved, and Bauer had to be exposed. The following days blurred into a storm of action. Hiroshi's team drafted precise and unyielding legal demands to the bank in Frankfurt. At first, the response was a cold refusal. The bank's lawyers dismissed the request, citing privacy laws, time limits, and lack of standing. Akari did not waver. She dismantled their excuses with surgical precision in a conference call that crackled with tension. She invoked the reputational damage of protecting a saboteur, reminded them of their reliance on global partners, and left them with a threat veiled so elegantly it felt like a promise. Within 48 hours, the files arrived encrypted and massive. Klang Gito, the young forensic specialist, barely left his desk. He worked in silence, surrounded by towers of empty coffee cups, his fingers a blur across the keyboards. Elena hovered nearby, her stomach twisted into knots of hope and dread. Hours stretched into days as the files were decrypted, parsed, and reconstructed. Finally, on the third night, just as the gray light of dawn crept over the city, Sai beckoned her with trembling hands. On his screen, two documents glowed side by side. Her bear her name and timestamp, her strategy intact. The second, created less than 2 hours later, carried Bauer's signature. Sai ran a differential analysis, and the results were devastating in their clarity. Revenue projections lowered, costs inflated, ratios skewed, all small changes, plausible in isolation, but together designed to discredit her. The logs were damning. Bauer had accessed her file minutes after she submitted it, downloaded it to his terminal, and uploaded a falsified version. Then a final log entry, an encrypted packet sent from Bauer's terminal to an offshore server in the Cayman Islands, already linked to Mercer's shell company. Minimized, Elena stared at the evidence, tears blurring her vision. This was no longer a suspicion, but the whispers of a ruined past. It was the truth, undeniable and pristine, preserved in lines of code and timestamps. Years of humiliation collapsed into a single exhale of vindication. Hiroshi's expression remained calm, but his eyes gleamed with the sharp light of opportunity. Akari closed her notebook with deliberate care. They had what they needed, but more than that, they had Bauer in a noose. He was reckless, greedy, and now fully exposed. He could be the shield Mercer hid behind, or the dagger that cut Mercer down. Receiver to confront Bauer took shape with terrifying efficiency. A discreet meeting in Geneva, away from Mercer's watchful eyes, arranged through intermediaries who understood how to lure a man with ego and fear. They would not storm his office or send lawyers to his door. They would meet him as equals, with the evidence arrayed before him like weapons on a table.
Elena felt a strange calm as the sun rose over Central Park, the city staring back to life below her. The ghosts that had haunted her for so long had finally revealed their faces. Bauer was no longer a shadow in her memory. He was a man of flesh and blood, vulnerable and corrupt, and he would soon be forced to choose. Either he dragged Mercer down with him, or Mercer dragged him into ruin. For the first time in years, Elena felt like she was no longer running from the past. She was chasing it down. And this time, she would not let it escape. Swallowing that broke over Manhattan was unlike any Elena had known. It was not just the light of a new day, but the beginning of an ending. The air was charged with an intensity bordering on electricity in the war room. The evidence against Bauer was no longer a fragile thread. It was a noose, tied and ready to tighten. Yet, Hiroshi insisted they move with precision, not haste.
Las mi stantine i predissimo dolla mercere colita di sinuva i tronera, che qualo tu no a Laura delanta. E il metina sono speti da Geneva, diano comulien discresiona, che lune distantiene, mercere stronghold del New York. Arrogant and restless, Bauer sonda dissettando, e l'ari sei cara e l'ono pretutta. Elena Akari che Hiroshi lo silvituno, deli 13 compri e gli unton cattipatiene. Come lo gettanici de nerossaria compresetto sui salpas, Elena son noi tatuadio, come là un dosetre trovere mitero, come il Berlin, che il teresto per so momentà, com tea parla, come ando spratino. 2 metina, pompriari serstari lo hotel caffè, elegante per ompilitare, che stete screto sitane con terne personalos espresso. Bauer un vanti e sono, se noi con creseria un assetto, lo esprisiete l'ostro tippinatro, soi lo nassuta sono mazione, con nottinno. E comprete Hiroshi sentanna sono pretistito, gari le sconsigno, che Elena que carsonionio, se stanta pue, come l'apri, lo sonetto sono conturentantre.
That underestimation was his first mistake. Akari wasted no time with pleasantries. She slid a sleek tablet across the polished table, her voice calm and steady as she spoke. Records of Bauer's insider trades were on the screen, the paper trail of his greed. His confident expression faltered for the first time. He stammered, fumbling for words, until Akari cut him off with surgical precision. Then came the second tablet containing the server logs, the differential analysis, and the encrypted packet sent to Mercer's offshore server. Wise mask crumbled. His hands trembled as he scrolled through the damning evidence, his face draining of color. Elena oversaw him, not with vengeance in her heart, but with an icy clarity.
This was the man who had stolen her life, who had sold her work for his advancement. She felt no satisfaction, only a grim recognition of what corruption looked like when stripped of its illusions.
You have a choice, Akari said softly, her words landing with the weight of inevitability. You can deny this and you will be destroyed alone, or you can tell the truth, and history will record you as the man who revealed the architect behind it all. Bauer's eyes darted between them, desperation leaking into his composure. His arrogance was gone, replaced by raw fear. He realized there was no escape, no path left except through confession. With trembling hands, he signed the statement Akari placed before him, detailing Mercer's role, the orders given, the strategy of manipulation, and the shell companies used to disguise their crimes. When the final signature dried on the page, Bauer sagged back in his chair, a man unmade. The dossier was complete. Hiroshi's contacts moved with ruthless efficiency. Within hours, the confession and files were transmitted to 3 of the world's most influential financial newspapers. Embargoed until 6 the next morning, they would be published simultaneously, ensuring no spin, no counter-narrative could take root before the truth consumed Mercer's empire. Elena barely slept that night. She stood at the Geneva shimmer under the stars. Every moment of her past humiliation flickered through her mind. The whispers in Berlin, the cold stares of colleagues who abandoned her, the years of exile. Soon the world would know the truth, not because she begged for it, but because she had fought for it. When morning came, the first headlines hit like thunder. Mercer's deceit exposed, framed analyst vindicated, years of corporate espionage revealed. Stock markets reacted instantly, shares linked to Mercer Capital plummeting, and trading halts were issued across exchanges. Regulators in New York, London, and Zurich announced coordinated investigations. Investors turned rabid, devouring their former ally with the same hunger he had once unleashed on others. Inside Mercer's headquarters, panic reigned. Emergency board meetings dissolved into shouting matches. His name, once spoken with awe, was now a curse, synonymous with betrayal. By evening, he was expelled, stripped of authority, and cast out to face the storm alone. The empire he had built with arrogance and cruelty crumbled overnight. For Elena, the moment was surreal. Watching it unfold on television, she felt neither triumph nor gloating. What coursed through her veins was something quieter, more profound, a vindication that no settlement, apology, or sum of money could equal. She had been erased, and now she had returned not as a victim, but as the one who tore down a titan. Hiroshi turned to her as the final report aired on screen. "This is only the beginning," he said, solemn but resolute, and Elena knew he was right.
Mercer was finished, but the war against corruption was far from over. The fall of the Titan was not the end of her story, it was the start of something far greater. The storm had passed, but in its wake lay a silence that was anything but empty. Across the financial world, Mercer's name had become a byword for deceit, and the ruins of his empire served as a cautionary tale. The headlines still screamed, the investigations deepened, but the war room in Geneva had been dismantled for Elena. The whiteboards were gone, the servers packed away, leaving only the faint outlines of where strategy had been mapped like a battle plan. Yet, her fight had not ended, it had only changed form. Cryer returned to New York. She did so not as a fugitive hiding from her past, but as a woman transformed. Her story was no longer whispered in back alleys or buried under false accusations. It was spoken aloud, written in print, broadcast across screens. People who had once dismissed her now sought her counsel, and offers poured in from firms eager to harness the fire of her vindication. But Elena looked at each proposal with cool detachment. To return to the game, to make the wealthy wealthier, felt hollow, a betrayal of everything she had endured. Hiroshi understood this before she even spoke about it. Their last meeting was in a quiet tea room overlooking Central Park, far from the noise of boardrooms and battlefields.
He laid before her a vision not of power, but of purpose, the Prometheus Institute, a foundation dedicated to corporate ethics and accountability. It would expose corruption, defend whistleblowers, and shine a relentless light into the shadows where greed thrived. "We need a guardian," he said, "not of wealth, but of truth. You are that guardian." Reluctance struck her with the weight of destiny. For so long, she had been defined by loss, her career, name, and dignity.
Now she was being offered something greater than restoration. She was being offered the chance to wield her scars as weapons and protect others from the same fate. She looked out at the city skyline, the vast grid of ambition and ruin, and felt something stir within her that had been dormant for years. Hope. She accepted. The following weeks were a blur of motion, not chaos, but creation. Offices were established in Frankfurt, Geneva, and New York. Teams of legal experts, investigators, and analysts gathered under her leadership. They came not for money, but for the conviction that integrity could be more than a word on a page. Elena moved among them with a calm authority, her eyes no longer weary but lit with purpose. The first cases that crossed her desk were small compared to Mercer's empire, but no less significant. A whistleblower in Milan silenced by threats. A manufacturing plant in Warsaw gutted by shallow takeovers. Each story carried echoes of her own, and each one fueled her resolve. She listened, strategized, and fought. And with every battle won, the Prometheus Institute grew stronger, its reputation spreading like fire through corridors of power. Still, there were nights when the past returned to her. She would wake in her modest apartment, the city's hum drifting through the window, and remember the long months of exile, when she was nothing but a ghost. But now, instead of fear, she felt a fierce clarity. She had been that ghost, and learned that even shadows can wield power if they choose to step into the light. One evening, as she left the Institute's headquarters, she passed a group of young interns huddled over documents, their faces alive with determination. She paused, unseen for a moment, and watched them. It struck her that they were the future she had once believed lost. The new generation who would not accept corruption as inevitable. In their focus, she saw the echo of her younger self, the analyst who had believed numbers could protect lives. And she realized she had become the guardian she once needed. Mercer's shadow lingered still. It was gone from the boardrooms, but not from the world. Rumors circulated of appeals, of desperate maneuvers to salvage his name. But Elena no longer feared them. It was a relic of a world she had helped dismantle. If it dared to rise again, she would be waiting. Her journey had begun in silence, her voice stolen, her name erased. It had carried her through humiliation, through fire, through nights of despair, and now, standing at the threshold of a new dawn, she understood the truth she wished to leave behind. Power, built on deceit, may dazzle for a season, but power rooted in truth endures. As she walked into the night, the city lights reflected in her eyes. Elena felt the weight of her past lift. She was no longer the woman bent under invisible chains. She was the guardian of tomorrow, armed with truth, sharpened by resilience, and unafraid of the battle still to come. The world had once tried to erase her. Now, she would ensure no one else would ever be silenced again.